Welcome back to the third and final session of Death, Dying, and Grieving. Uh, we've done grieving. We did dying, which also involved death. But today is kind of what do we do? We're sort of rounding out everything with and then what, right? Maybe death happens and then what? Uh, let's begin with a word of prayer. Okay, the Lord be with you. Gracious God, we know that you are there at our birthing. You're there as we make our journey, and you are there to receive us at the end when life closes. Be with us today, we ask. Fill us with your spirit to help us understand the depth of your love, the generosity of your gift of life, and the care that you bring to us, especially through others, when grief is ours in times of death. We pray it in Christ's name. Amen. Okay. I think, yeah, give us that piece there. Okay, that this is somewhat inelegantly. I actually thought we could have edited that out, but it does capture more or less what we're doing. So, at least three things we want to touch on here. Just issues of the physical nature of the human body. Bodies don't just disappear when you die; they're there to be dealt with. The practices that we have for after death, funerals, memorial services, remembrances, whatever, a number of things to go with that. And then we want to just touch on a little bit of the Remembrance Garden and how that might begin to unfold some of this for us. And then want to allow some time for what I heard Nadia Boltz-Weber, if any of you know her, at a session once. She said, "I don't do Q&A because I don't have any answers. I just do Q&O, questions and opinions." That will be it. We'll give some time. We both have opinions about these, mostly the same, maybe a little different. I don't know, but everybody's got opinions about some of these things, and I think it's good. It's instructive. Here, what did I forget there? Anyway,
just a word of caution that this presentation does have pictures. None of them are what I would call grotesque or they're all mostly old-timey pictures, but there are pictures of people in caskets. So and there are pictures of apparatuses, apparati, and things. So just to let you know that that's coming, because that's what we're talking about.
Can I just say, this is a strange anecdote, but I had a young secretary once upon a time, might have been early 20s, and had this picture on her desk. And it was her mother in her casket. And I just, but that was her remembrance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that just seems so.
I think we'll be talking a little bit about that. The way that the reactions we have to dead bodies, what's conditioned that in us, where has the culture been and where is the culture now? And I mean, all that stuff. And what does the church have to say about that? That does seem just unusual. I'm wondering what it might have meant.
Yeah, and
comfort, was it a way of comfort to her? Was there some
I could never ask.
Yeah.
I could never ask.
But I think that there are some cultures that is appropriate.
Yeah.
That is something that is done often.
Interesting.
I just found it sad.
Yeah.
That was her remembrance.
Yeah.
That was my reaction.
What did you
I would just share that my mother-in-law felt very overwhelmed at my husband's visitation because we had him cremated. So that was her last chance to see him. And she made a point of having many pictures taken. And I don't know that I've asked her, but I don't believe she's ever looked at them. It was the comfort of knowing it was there if she chose to see it.
Yeah.
I've got pictures of mom, and an aunt and a grandmother. Because at the time, a couple of them died, we were in Germany.
Yeah.
And that was a way to share the memorial service or the funeral with us then. And I keep them, I don't look at them every day or anything like that, but I appreciated very much having those pictures.
And we were in Germany, where you go into some of the old churches and there's an altar with the saint body still there.
Oh.
Yeah, and behind glass for everyone to come and watch, look at. Yeah.
Watch would be interesting.
300 years old, still laying there. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, well, isn't this interesting? The variety of experiences we may have had. And when else do you get together to talk about these things? I mean, this is not not usually cocktail party type stuff. Okay, well, let's go to the first slide. Oh, go ahead.
In regards to the picture, if the deceased person had struggled for a long time, it would be a remembrance that now that person is at peak on the.
Yeah, grief counselors I've known have said, there's just so many different ways to think about what viewing the body of a person, a loved one who's died, can mean. Sometimes it's comforting, sometimes it's distressing, sometimes the person was so emaciated it just doesn't look like them anymore. But it's a kind of individualized experience. Well, here's a picture here just to get us going. It was the case not all that many years ago, really, certainly before the beginning of the 20th century, that most funerals were done in home, not a funeral home or a funeral parlor, but in the parlor at home, as is the case in that photo. And so one does not need to go to a funeral home or whatever to do a funeral. You can have a funeral at home. You do not legally have to have a dead body embalmed. That's a service of funeral directors. And while we're at it, yes. And I looked up online in Columbus, Ohio, there is no prohibition. If you want to bury your loved one in your backyard, you need only check with local authorities about anything like, gas lines or whatever, or something. I'm guessing Bexley probably has some prohibition against this because you can't even hang your laundry outside of Bexley or whatever. Yeah, boom, right. But anyway, we'll talk about some of that in a little bit too. But did you want to say anything else about this?
Only that, I mean, I found this picture on Reddit and the kind of casket is fascinating to me because if you notice, it has hinges and it folds down and it folds up. So then you can fold it to put it together. And I just think that's neat. Yeah. Yes.
Early on, most people who did funerals were often furniture makers, and they were the ones who made actually then coffins, and then they sort of got into the business of just handling. But yeah.
In 1943 or 44, my grandfather was at our home. He died at our home, and my mother wanted him to be there instead of a funeral home. And it was the first time I ever saw a dead body. So I probably had some anxiety about that. But over the casket was a very fine maroon kind of veil. So and that would be protecting from organisms or flies or whatever.
Yeah, right.
So, and I do not remember how long, well, he was there for a 24-hour period because of the next day there was funeral and so forth. So in my lifetime, that was not all that had come. There was a crepe on the door and so the neighbors knew there was a death in the family. And so it was a nice way of letting other people know what's going on.
Yeah,
I was just going to just say, my grandfather passed away in the hospital. And the whole time he was there, he wanted to go home.
yeah, right.
So what they decided to do was to have the viewing at home. And the burial, of course, was the funeral service and all that was up at the church. But they did have the viewing visitation at home,
Yeah.
so he could come home.
Before the funeral industry became the funeral industry, it was not at all uncommon for people to be laid out as it was on the, say, dining room table, you know, and the practice of, you know, all the flowers that come with a death experience were really initially to keep everything nice and fragrant. If it was a day or two after the death, well, we've carried that over, you know, all the flowers that show up in a funeral home, which is nice, but not really their original purpose, of course.
Talking about
Yeah, go ahead.
pictures, I'm sorry to keep interrupting. My son's mother-in-law, when we were in Harrisburg, was pointing out her dining room. There's this huge picture going back to early 30s, 20s, 1900s, or not, late 1900s.
Yeah.
Huge picture of her family. And she goes, and there's the dead body. He was sitting in a chair, propped up in this picture that brought all these people together. And this hangs in her dining room.
That was not uncommon.
Yeah, well, and it is even now something I've learned that's become somewhat common again. People are asking morticians now, can we at the viewing just have my loved one sitting there in his Ohio State easy chair? And they can do that if you want. I've seen some photos of that kind of thing.
Weekend at Bernie style,
Huh?
like Weekend at Bernie style.
I don't know, whatever.
Yikes.
Well, maybe just another word on funerals and then move forward to some other things. But the basic cost of a funeral, of course, is not cheap. If you can get a funeral done for $10,000, you're really doing well. But it's more than that. Probably you all know that. Cremations generally maybe $5,000 to $10,000, and so forth. So the cost issue of funerals, we'll talk about this more in a minute with Jessica Mitford, but you know, that has been off-putting to a number of people because the funeral industry has become an industry. To my way, this is my opinion. I don't answer it. Everybody's got a different opinion. I think the funeral industry deserved a lot of criticism probably 60, 70 years ago. Much has changed. And on the whole, I think these are very professional people who nowadays do the bulk of grief counseling in our culture. And I've had funeral directors tell me this. People come, they have no church connection, they have no pastor, they don't believe in going to therapy. So any kind of grief work that they do is usually enabled by the funeral director, and many funeral homes have professional grief counselors now on staff to aid with that. I'll just say, I thought when both of my parents died, died at different times, but same funeral home in my small hometown in Upper Sandusky. Our funeral director was as helpful or more helpful than the pastor. Partly small town sort of stuff where they're not part of a national chain of funeral homes. That's become a real trend. Even Schedinger's downtown now is part of a national.
Really?
Yeah. Well, they've carefully orchestrated it so they have still a lot of say in what they do, but just overhead wise, it was useful. Really.
When Judy died, I used the Ohio Cremation Society up on North High, and because I knew I would have her funeral at the church, she was going to be cremated. The things that cost me more, were the urn I chose.
Yeah.
And I had a decently long obituary in the dispatch, which also went through that. I spent just under 2,000.
Oh,
So it is, if that is if you don't want the other things through that other service, there are options that are not nearly as
Yeah.
expensive.
I think the cultural things are fairly frightening. Well, they were frightening for me as a child because I got dragged to every visitation. And in Ukrainian culture, it was a time to gossip and drink.
It's
So
short.
it depends.
Probably
But
secular.
yeah, and then, well, the fun part was there would be the gossip and drinking, and then there would be the singing, which was absolutely, that's a great way to go out,
Yeah.
to have that kind of wonderful 4-part harmony singing. But I couldn't, if I sat with the 3 crazy ants, the gossip was so pointed. And so I thought you weren't supposed to say mean things about the dead, but no, it was pretty
Different
pointed.
culture, different.
Yeah.
Different. Well, just give us the next slide there. Quicker on this. Most of us are probably acquainted with Christian funeral, maybe less than we used to be, because we go to all kinds of friends things, but still, a Christian funeral is a service of worship. For instance, if you look in the PLW and the basic outline for that, there it is. But you have you do this same essential structure as you would do on a Sunday morning. You gather, you hear the word, there's a time for sending. Should have put in there Eucharist, optional, but many times. I had a just really meaningful experience a few years ago. A high school friend of mine died rather young, and I didn't know he was a winemaker in his adulthood. They had Eucharist at his funeral, and we drank the wine that Denny had made, had in stock. That was really a meaningful kind of a thing. So Eucharist is, there's always a sending, and a blessing and a dismissal, and then committal at the graveside, committing the body to the ground, or if it's remains in an inurnment, same kind of a process there. So that is no longer the cultural standard for how we do things. I mean, that religious folks have funeral rites, but memorial services, celebrations of life, not in any way saying, it's again opinion, not an answer, not in any way saying those are inappropriate or whatever, but if you're a person of faith and so forth, it's very appropriate to have a service of worship when you do the same things you do at any service, but you thank God, you praise God, you invoke God's blessing, you get sent on the way to do God's mission and whatnot. Okay, it's ready for the body business here then. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, this is and you want to sorry, the quality of that picture on the left, my printer wasn't great. You want to say something about that?
That's one of those pictures where there is a dead body in the picture. They're propping them up. I believe it's the on the left. There may be even 2. I don't know. That gentleman, he's holding a pipe of some kind, so he might have imbibed a little too much of whatever that is. But
there's a barrel there.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But I think I don't know where you got this picture from, but it looks to me like that is one of those pictures where somebody is propping up somebody. Well, but there's a body behind them too. So I don't know. I don't know.
Lady is smoking this big sign.
I don't know, but those look like some fun people, and I was kind of.
Well, yeah, my thought of using that image, I'm not sure about all that, but I think this is an image of a home experience and an older time, obviously, when the gathering part of what you might do in a church service had a different kind of a meaning, sort of thing. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, then you see a more contemporary casket. Now they're called. I don't know if you've ever carefully examined the casket, or you may or may not know, but the body is somewhat elevated, but before the lid is closed and buried, there's a little crank that lowers the body down. And I recently did a funeral for the wife of my home pastor. She was almost 100 years old. And their funeral director had a phrase about, do you want to be present at the closing? So family gathered around and they literally cranked Teddy down lower, whatever needed to be arranged, and then they closed the lid and so forth. So that's another little cultural moment that but I wanted to spend just a second here talking about bodies, just the significance of the human body and where we are culturally with that. The trend clearly has moved more toward cremation. And I think partly that's been driven by the funeral industry's manipulation of costs, and people said, I don't need all that. I mean, I don't need that. And the thought that we don't need to take up land space by burying all these bodies and coffins and vaults and chemicals and so forth that go into that process. So if it's truly ashes to ashes and dust to dust, what's the deal? On the other hand, and we'll talk about this in a second, just go to the next slide. Maybe that's a good place. There are pros and cons to how we deal with bodies. Might as well run out all four of those days. Viewing the body, having a physical body at the funeral. You can have a body at the funeral that is then cremated, and do not need to carry the whole casket. The pros and cons of burying a body, or pros and cons of cremating a body, or we'll also talk about another process of what's called aquamation or alkaline hydrolysis. Or water cremation, which is that's what they call it, but it's not. That's an oxymoron.
It is.
I don't know, just opinions on this, the pros and cons. How do you deal with the body issue? Yes.
I remember my grandmother died in 1986. It was my first day of work, and there was something about not being able to see her. They did not have, it was like a closed casket service. She did not want to have people see her, but I found that really troubling. I mean, yes, I remember her in life. I remember being with her, but I was really troubled that the whole service that went on for almost 2 hours. And then my aunt swung herself on top of it. So that's the image I have, which is found to comfort me. So not being able to see her, for some reason, really last week. Yeah, and I missed saying goodbye. I missed seeing her.
Yeah.
When my dad died, not all the family have been there, and so what my mom chose was to have a private viewing. He was not involved, so but she had the next morning, family could come in and say their goodbyes, and then he was taken. But that gave closure for some of us were there, but not as. So that's what she chose.
I think Nancy and then Al.
If one chooses to donate your body to science, how does that interrupt the viewing and funeral and other
Yes,
things?
on that.
I do. Yeah, so if you donate your body to science, you cannot be involved. Yeah, they pretty much take it right away. So you're gone. Yeah. From my understanding, I don't have firsthand knowledge of this. This is me looking up some things in preparation for this, but because they need to do what they need to do to prep for whatever they're going to do, right? So Yeah, if you're gonna donate your body to science, you should say your goodbyes pretty quickly.
But they do return after they've used it.
Correct. If they're the pieces that are still good,
Well-
they will cremate
They
when
cremate.
they're done, and which could be a couple years. With or whatever that process is, they
Want to donate my eyes? That's what
Yeah.
my driver's license.
Organ donation is a somewhat different.
It's a different thing?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to look into that work
Mhm.
more deeply.
And actually, your funeral director can tell you all the ins and outs of that,
Okay.
part of what they do. Bill, and then
Yeah.
Al, but
Uh,
go ahead.
Both of my parents donated their body to the anatomy department of the University of Cincinnati. It was not an organ donation program. It was for anatomy students. And what was left was buried in a cemetery in Cincinnati, a common plot. So you had nothing to view or anything, but they did notify you when the last parts of their bodies were interred there and where that site was, so that if you wanted to go visit that site, you could do so.
I don't know.
My contribution to Q and O opinions would be my opinion, which is that there's something positive to be said for the visual remembering. To not just thoughts, but actually being able to see something. But I have always, as long as I can remember, I've encouraged families to make that a photograph of the deceased rather than the body. And a lot of families have gone, oh, that would be better. And so we just did it. Well, 2, 3,
Beginning of March.
beginning of March, 3 weeks ago for Karen's best friend. And she was cremated, but we did have photos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. Being able to envision.
We also made the service available on Zoom for those who
Yeah.
couldn't make it.
We zoomed it coast to coast to coast. And
COVID
that helped,
opened that
people were
door.
able
Yeah.
to
In a lot
go
of space.
Yeah.
and see.
So my take on the whole body thing is, obviously, if you're not comfortable with it, don't do what makes you uncomfortable. But the analogy of like when you have multiple pets and one passes away and the veterinarian tells you, make sure that your other pets see the body of the other pet, or else they will, and make sure that they sniff it and they take time so that they understand that the pet has died. If not,
That's right.
then they will keep looking
Wow.
and they will keep looking and they won't understand what's going on.
Huh.
And
We are animals. So at the basic level, there is some understanding of the same thing.
Mm.
So to be able to go and see this person is no longer here on a basic level that we probably don't even comprehend, but on a subconscious something, I think that if you can, you should.
And this is one of the ways that we work out grief sometimes. I don't think I mentioned this much in the first session, but searching for the lost object is what grief people talk about. And if you've ever lost a physical, tangible piece of jewelry or something was important, you do tend to, did I put it there? You want to figure out what happened. And so that idea of the reality of it is pretty significant.
I think Bill had a
Bill, okay.
When did the Roman Catholic Church give up their theological objections to cremation? It wasn't too long ago, I don't
That's
think.
your department.
Yeah, I do not have the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. Does anybody?
I think it's around 86 or 88. Yeah, because
Why were they opposed?
we,
My understanding was that they were afraid that some people were doing that out of mockery of the doctrine of the resurrection of the
yeah,
dead.
it was about
And
resurrection.
that cremation was a slap in God's face by
Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
Now, my mom was a lifelong Lutheran, would not have cared what the Catholic Church thought, but her opinion was that she could not be resurrected if she was cremated. So, yeah, dad was buried whole, she was buried whole.
So-
Yeah,
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Just to go theological here on that for a second. You know, I again an O, not an A, just an opinion, but that's that line of thought, which is not at all uncommon. It seems to me that that deserves some theological reflection on what we think the resurrection is all about, more than the sort of just the physicality issue or whatever. I mean, if the God who created out of nothing can't bring something out of nothing on the other side, and then what are we saying? You know, theologically, what Paul says, or the Apostle Paul. I agree with him on this, so it's the Apostle Paul. It's just you're talking about Paul and women, and it's just Paul. But, you know, says that we'll all be raised with a spiritual body, which I take to mean there's some kind of continuity that he envisioned with who we are as people. But I think was carefully trying to say, don't be confused. We're not, if you had an arm cut off or something in battle or whatever, that's not the point. It's a spiritual. I don't know what necessarily that means, but the point that it finally occurred to me as I began to teach and really think about some of this, you know, we are our bodies. The idea that you have some piece of you that's an immortal something, spirit, soul, whatever, totally disconnected from body. Whatever that's all about is certainly conditioned by the body that you walk around in. I mean, I've said to people in class, if I had a body that looked like George Clooney, I would have a different existence. I'm pretty sure of that. People would just be amazed when you walk in the room, or if you had an athlete's body, if you had the body of LeBron James, your reality would be different. And that would certainly condition your spirit, your character, the soul, the essence of who you are. And so how we think about the ephemeral, the metaphysical, the spiritual, the soul, whatever, and the very physical body. I like Herb Anderson, that for all our losses, all our grief. He talks about being an embodied soul or an ensouled body. How do you untangle what those things mean? Okay, it's long on that, but yeah, thanks, please.
Just one other kind of perspective on this. So I had a friend, a good friend I knew from my time in China and other places, who tragically passed away a few years ago, along with his parents. He was in the building in Miami that collapsed. And so it was super sudden and really hard for a lot of us. He was in his early 30s. And they eventually found his body along with his parents, and they were cremated, so we were never able to see the body, but there was, I think, a huge sense of relief for us in just knowing that they had been found and that there was something left that was, able to be cremated and put somewhere. And so I think there was, we didn't actually get to ever see him again. And so in that sense, there was something kind of missing, I think, as far as closure, but a relief in knowing that his body was found and cared for.
And that instinct, whatever that is, suggests to me that at some level the importance of body is recognized. Culturally, what I've heard from funeral directors and whatnot is, a number of people come now, parent, grandmother, somebody has died, and say, just, we don't want a service. We don't need any of that. Actually, just do the cremation, and actually, we don't even care what you do with the cremains, the ashes. And so, funeral directors will often have a shelf of urns, and they have an obligation to keep those for, I think it's 5 years or something. And if not claimed after proper notification, here in Franklin County, there's a place where they will receive a dignified burial of the cremains. But I think this comes out of a kind of a cultural non-caring about the body, and maybe we have a role to play in helping to sensitize that. I don't know. It's an interesting, I don't know, it's a thought, but it's not going. Yeah, but can we go to Kathy back there first?
Okay, evidently I have a different perspective on seeing the body. I have a picture of my grandfather in the casket, and I have a few other pictures of him, but the one that comes to mind first is in that casket. I don't like that to be my last memory. Okay, both my parents had chosen to be cremated. When mom died, they came in and said, she's too heavy. We can't do that. She will not be cremated. Or no, sorry. Willed their bodies to science. They would not take it because she was too heavy.
Yeah.
So she was then cremated right away. And put in a box, and we didn't find her for a long time. Anyway, then when my dad was dying, and I talked with my brother after seeing some urns, actually vases, but they could be used as urns from places. It was done by a person in Iowa who had ties to both Petaloo, a camp that my father had a great deal to do with, and also Holden Village. So he and I talked a lot. And after calling my brother to make sure that they hadn't already made arrangements, I just went in and said, I'll take two. Because the urns were the green of the Iowa Hills and the black of the Iowa soil. So that's what Dad was there. My sister, however, was bookworm, a librarian. She has a book on tombstone stuff.
Yeah. Yes.
I hope this isn't a repetitive question. Is it the responsibility of the family to regard the wishes of the dead person? Like if the dead person just wants to be cremated and put in the ground, but the family is they wish for something more.
Reverend or not? Well,
I can respond to that.
okay, yeah,
I can nothing.
yeah,
His friends took over. They had a party for him afterwards, but he wanted nothing.
oh,
On a legal issue, as a,
yeah,
my best friend, her partner died, they had long written legal papers that my best friend would make her, would make her arrangements. And she wanted to be cremated. They would not take my best friend's signature for that cremation. They wanted a relative, sister, brother, other friend, and she challenged it legally. But that is what the Funeral Home Association now is doing as the standard, is to request next of kin, because they have been sued by next of kin for those decisions. But there is so as a gay person, you do face difficulties with not being next of kin.
I was under the impression that had changed, but I may be wrong. Bill, you got
Yes, in my and Ruth's case, we found out that the state of Ohio now allows you to make a declaration of someone other than a blood relative who can dispose of the remains. But you should do that, otherwise the default is a family member.
They wanted it on their form, which the person was dead.
yes. But I believe there is a technical legal title for the person to whom you entrust your body. And so but it all has to be done with forethought. And so
she had that.
Yeah, okay.
She had that.
Yeah.
So it, like a power of attorney,
Yeah.
they consider that gone when the person
I
has
see.
died.
Okay.
So I'm just saying, if you think you've got that taken care of and you're
Triple
not next
check.
of kin.
Yeah, the tension is there. Somebody else has Karen.
I was just going to say, when my friend passed away at home, and the police did a wellness check and found her, so she went to the morgue. They needed to have the body identified, and she had a cousin whom she hadn't spoken to in 10 years at least, whatever. And they needed Elaine to do the identification, and they sent her a picture. And Elaine said, I haven't seen her, I can't do it, so I'm signing it over to Karen
Oh.
to make that decision for identification. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's what
If, well, anyway. Yes.
I was
Bam.
gonna say, observing. We seem to have moved as a society to these celebrations of life,
Yeah.
which take place weeks and months later. And the funeral, when I was growing up, it was immediate. It was as fast as you could do it.
Oh, yeah.
And that is no longer the norm to my mind. And I don't know how much that then drives, whether they're cremated or, I mean, to me, that would drive the cremation to be done.
One of the things that has changed is that the population is so much more dispersed. So your family members are all over from Seattle to Miami to London. It's not like in a small town, you died, everybody could be there in 2 days. So I think that has to get people together for a meaningful service. And COVID, of course, pushed that all back months. I think that's part of the reason. And then, of course, yeah, that feeds into the cremation piece. How much, I don't know. But Bill, did you?
I want to change topic slightly. So if there's anything you want to follow up with that? Okay. One method of after death practices, as you did mention in your first slide, is burial at sea.
Oh, yeah.
I mentioned that it ties in several ways. One, any member of the armed services can have their remains buried at sea, either the full body or remains. Also, it speaks to the issue of seeing or not seeing someone, because in combat on naval vessels, burial at sea was almost essential because there was no morgue on board combat ships to retain the bodies. And nowadays, I understand even more people, civilians, are doing private burials at sea too. So that adds another dimension. I also think to think of all the worldwide explorers of millennia past who died at sea, and the entire crew was lost. So there was nothing ever found, known, or seen about them, but they were gone.
Yeah. And thus the Navy hymn, "Oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea." Can we go? I want to just skip forward a couple of slides to the one about Jessica Mitford right there. Because we've already, I want to introduce you to somebody that you all know but never knew that you did. Anybody ever heard of Jessica Mitford?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Just real quickly. In 1963, Jessica Mitford, who was British, published her book, The American Way of Death. And it was a searing critique of the American funeral industry. She opened the door to the thought of cremation in a way that had never really been thought of before. She exposed a lot of corruption in the funeral industry, going after rich people to charge them more, selling them stuff they didn't ever even think about. The way that funeral homes took money, prepaid funerals, and then scam people. So a lot of that has been cleaned up. On the 25th anniversary, she did an update on the American Way of Death Revisited. Her thinking permeated American culture in the 60s in a way that we're not even aware of now. But it sowed, I think, deserved distrust in the funeral industry, which had truly become an industry, but it also led to many, many legal reforms. For instance, the funeral industry cannot use the money you prepay a funeral for. Now, that goes into an escrow kind of a thing, can be transferred from state to state, because there was just a lot of stuff going on that wasn't good. It's a really interesting read. If you're interested, I have a copy here. I have a couple of a book review of her book, which points out that, interestingly, she did not do any research with people who had funerals and embalmed bodies and could have expressed some of the comfort that some of us have shared here. But she did all of her research with the flyers from funeral industries advertising their extravagant services, or part of her British culture, which did do the American thing of much funeral homes and embalmed bodies. And she talked to people who thought they got just cheated by the funeral industry. So she made an important contribution. I think we've now had something of a corrective, and there's a couple more pictures. But just the kind of stuff she put in her book, they would sell you these like slippers, the practical burial slippers, and all this kind of stuff. Good service, probably helped clean up a lot of stuff. So if you run across her name, that's the deal. But maybe let's see. I don't know where we are. You want to go? I skipped over a couple of slides. You want to go forward from there?
Yeah, I mean, we're
Okay.
running.
Yeah, we're up against it. Go ahead to well, I think we've already talked some about funeral industry, but it's just something to remind us if you're going to do a burial, a lot of stuff gets used, right? Some details there of how much of that, all the land that's used. But let's go to the cremation slide and talk a little more specifically about that. Well, one bit just before that right. I don't have anybody ever actually seen a crematory at the funeral home? See how that's done, and so some things just to know. Cremation leaves a rather large carbon footprint. Normally done with natural gas, so you've got that. You got to have really intense temperatures to do what cremation is going to do. So that's something to think about, and that's obviously funeral practices, chemicals going into the ground. Okay, that isn't necessarily eco-friendly. There's a bit of a downside to cremation. So one cremation produces about as much CO2 as a 609-mile car journey in an average car. Whatever. I don't know if that matters much. The next slide, then, if you've never seen the one just before that, Dave, if you've never seen what cremains or what we normally call ashes are not really ashes. They're you've got anything that would turn into ash has basically been burned off. You've got bones, and those are pulverized, but the cremains are gritty kind of substances. So if you think about, I'm going to throw them to the wind, yeah, there's a little bit of that, but they don't just all go away.
Pay attention to which way the wind is going.
Yeah. But there's a picture then on the right of a crematory. That's a simple wooden casket that would be burned, but sometimes they use a cardboard kind of a thing or a wicker sort of thing also. But yeah, Karen.
I was just surprised, maybe naively surprised at any rate, when you picked up Carol's remains, how heavy it was.
Yeah. Human cremains will fill about a shoebox, the typical size person, about a shoebox size of stuff. But it all depends on how large a person you are. A very large 300-pound person is more stout. A very small, or someone who has become emaciated through cancer or something, they weigh 85 pounds at death. Literally not so much. Well, give us one more slide then. Are you up on this stuff? Much the aquamation process?
I mean, a little bit. They've just yeah, I mean it's all there. So basically it puts it's a dissolution at the dissolving of all of your soft tissues in a solution that makes you just like a sludge, and then you are put down a drain, actually. And what's left is bones that are then pulverized.
And that's done locally.
No,
It's not legal in Ohio.
not legal in Ohio. However, in my research, I found out that you can do it for animals in all 50 states. So if it's legal for animal, in my opinion, if it's legal for animals, why is it not legal for humans?
would suspect that the funeral industry has a lobby.
Oh,
Because what's interesting is that the chemicals that they use for this, they neutralize any kind of illness that you like, any kind of germs or whatever that would have been in you, any kind of chemotherapy, any kind of whatever, all of that stuff is neutralized. So basically, like I put in, the final liquid output is considered a sterile mix of water and basic organic compounds, such as salts, sugars, peptides, and amino acids. And it's basically known to be exceptional fertilizer, which is what they use the animals for.
Yes.
So, but because some people get really weirded out by the idea of, well, that's human remains and it's going to contaminate the water system and it's going to blah, 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 blah. So that's why a lot of states are just like, won't even have the discussion. There is one facility in town if you tell them you want that, they will put you in take you to a different state, have it, and then bring you back. But that defeats the whole point of having a lesser carbon footprint.
Plus the fact that to transport a body across state lines, it must be embalmed.
There's that too.
So it's think about that. If you want to be cremated, but you die in Florida, you're either going to have to be cremated in Florida or you can't be brought back here. By the way, embalming became a practice during the Civil War, when for the first time, because we had railroads that could transport, people wanted the body of a dead soldier to come back to Pennsylvania or back to Virginia or whatever. And so they figured out how to use formaldehyde to keep a body so that you could do that. Prior to that, you just buried on the battlefield because there was couldn't get a body back fast enough to do that. I suspect aquamation is now about where cremation was 75 years ago, and it may become the new thing. But let's just touch on, and we'll wrap up with the green burial stuff. It is, and I'll leave this here for one see. There's a preserve out near in Gambier where you can have a green burial. Simply, green burial involves no embalming, just a simple. Your family can prepare the body for burial. It's ecologically simply returning you to the soil. There's natural decomposition the same way that any dead animal, whatever, but you're buried in the ground. There are only 8 or 9 places in Ohio that are certified green burial sites, so you can't just get a green burial at your local cemetery. And that's mostly because the cemeteries say, no, we're not going to do that. And the reason they don't want to do it is because if you're not buried in a coffin in a vault, the ground's going to collapse. And who wants to deal with all that? Okay. Plus, there's a financial incentive to all that too. But it's certainly a trend, and I think something that you can examine if you want to see this stuff again, whatever. Yeah.
We looked into Greenlawn Cemetery because they said they had green burial sites, but it turned out you're right. Because they don't want the ground to sink afterwards, you have to buy a kind of vault to go over it.
Right, and which is certainly going to slow down the natural process of right. For green burial sites, and certainly the preserve out there in Gambier, you pay a fee to join the conservancy. I think it's $5,000, but then of course it's much less expensive just to bring the body there. That would leave us about 1 minute to talk about the Remembrance Garden. Well, by the way, that last slide there, could you just push? I had a student, actually it was a former student, came back to audit a class I taught just before I retired. She did the green burial of her husband on their farm out by Newark. And
Is that Jane?
Jane Hunter, yes. So with her permission, that's there. And that quote from Ben Stewart, I wanted to lift up because some of Ben's thinking went into our purpose statement for our Remembrance Garden. So there's a kind of tough beauty about this whole thing, which is realistic. This is how people were buried for centuries. Okay, but to the Remembrance Garden, here, well, okay. Early on, we started talking about this as a memorial garden. And then the task force got around to thinking about it's about remembering. Let's use that language. So this is going to be a place for people's cremains. We're not going to bury any body there, but for pet cremains or human cremains to be put into the soil. Getting all the details of that, but mostly a place to remember. So whether that's actually your loved one's physical remains there, or just your place, we want to go and remember somebody or something, that can be the issue too. And yeah.
And a key piece of that, I'm sorry, you may have not wanted to mention this. A key piece of that will be also having a remembrance book.
Yes,
that we're going to have just inside the window in the sanctuary to switch things over from looking at the body to telling the story.
Yeah.
We're going to tell the person's story. They get a page in the book.
Yeah.
That can stay there.
So you can put a picture there, or include the obituary, or some write-up, or some memory, or whatever the case may be. Now we were supposed to have Q and O, but we did a lot of that. But are there last thoughts? That's not a good way to say it. Last.
I'm really grateful for having done this, because not only did it make me think about my beloved dead, but it cued my memory for so many other things. So thank you.
Yes, Michelle.
This is a little bit more in the grieving process notes. So my parents, well, we've had funeral services for them at their church. And I had seen, and it's pretty common here, that on the backside of the bulletin is like a life story kind of thing.
Yeah.
Longer than what we did for their obituaries in the paper, certainly much more detail, but still has to fit on the back of a bulletin. And it really helped me process their deaths because I wrote them.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like I had a better understanding of my mother 3 days after she died than my entire 39 years before that, which is a shame, but it was a big help to do that.
Along those same lines, being executor of Carol's will, I had everything. And I had albums upon albums and boxes of pictures. And I really did take the time and go through them all and pitched what didn't seem necessary, but to me, that was a grieving process and also a way to give a special tribute to her because she had no family except for her cousin. And a lot of pictures that I saw were of her great-grandparents and things like that from her father's side. And I was pretty sure that when the cousin would get them, she was from the mother's side, and that those pictures may never see the light of day again. And that was important to me too, to respect that part of her family.
Well, I want the next to the last word, and the last word is yours. I want to share just from an article that was in the Christian Century. You have a copy of this you want, called "Green Burial as an Act of Faith." Here's a quote from Ben Stewart, whose words we had, and so forth. He does a lot of speaking about green burials, and so here's the last bit of this. Stewart says that ideally he'd like to be buried in a grove under a tree and by a stream, but he knows that might not be possible. So he gives the same affirmation to his family that he gives to the audiences at his natural burial talks. And it's this: our culture makes natural burial really tough, so don't put undue pressure on yourself to do it perfectly. And then he says, if you pump me full of chemicals and put me in a big old metal vault coffin, he says, I know I'm still held in God and really ultimately still held in the earth. A gracious way, I think, of thinking about, don't stress on this overly much, but
I know I've been plugging her books this entire time, but really, if you are interested in how other cultures treat their dead and honor their dead, this is from Caitlin Doty, From Here to Eternity, Traveling the World to Find the Good Death. She talks about, a funeral pyre in Colorado to, Tibet, where they put people on a mountain and have the buzzards have their way, to in Japan, where they have like this whole big temple full of these little Buddhas that have LED lights on them, and then you tap in your code, and then like behind there's your cremains. So you go in and you tap in your code, and then your little Buddha lights up, and that's where you are. Like it's a whole bunch of stuff. It's so super interesting. Some of it is very macabre because there's other cultures that think it's very, very, okay to have an actual skull of your person just hanging out with you all the time. Interesting. But yeah, just this fascinating book. So I cannot recommend this enough.
The title.
It is From Here to Eternity,
So.
Traveling the World to Find the Good Death by Caitlin Doty, Doughty.
Is that on the original the book
It is.
list?
It is on the original book
When
list.
you're the first time, or if you don't have the book list that they passed out, I can make copies of that for you and get those to you. I can do this right now if you want, but yeah, they gave a book list out the first week.
yeah.
How can I get my family to be cheerful about my planning my funeral? They're just doing la 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 la. They're not on board.
Call a meeting and have me come.
There you go.
Thank you.
That's it.
Help me. I will help facilitate. Yeah.
Okay,
So
thank you.
thank you folks so much for that. Next week, we're going to do a 1 week revisiting of the Getting to Know You series. Paula Carson is going to be interviewed next week. And then the first 2 weeks of April, Elaine Disbro, do you want to say a word about what you're going to be doing the first 2 weeks of April?
So a lot of you probably know, but I most recently living abroad in Northern Ireland, getting a degree in conflict transformation and social justice. So we're going to spend 2 weeks talking about peace, conflict, and reconciliation, and looking at that. Kind of the first week will be a little bit more from some of the academic dimensions and theories and the history of Northern Ireland, and then week 2 is going to focus on religion and peace building. So.
Awesome.
Very exciting. So,
Write me something.
Yes, I'm going to send you.
she is. It's already yes.
Okay. Yep. If you want copies of any of these things, you can grab up here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, right.